virgin rancher took shelter with 2 Apache sisters. His life was never the same. Jacob wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting against the harsh Arizona sun. The land stretched endlessly before him, golden and dry, with jagged red rocks rising like silent sentinels in the distance. He had left his small ranch that morning, hoping to reach the nearest trading post before the afternoon heat became unbearable. He was a young man, barely 22, and though he had grown up around his uncle's ranch, life on his own was proving far tougher than he had ever imagined. His hands, calloused from working the land, ached as he adjusted the worn leather strap of his pack. Inside were a few essentials: some dried meat, a canteen of water, a blanket, and a small knife that had belonged to his father. He had packed lightly, thinking only a day's journey lay ahead. Yet now, with the sun high overhead, he realized he might have underestimated the distance and the desert. Jacob's ranch had been his life, but it was a lonely life. His uncle had passed away the previous year, leaving the young man to inherit the small homestead. Though it was more than a shack in the wilderness, it was not much else. The fields had to be tended, the animals cared for, and the well repaired constantly. Jacob had tried to adapt quickly, but there were days like this when the enormity of his isolation weighed heavily on him. The desert could be beautiful, but it was also cruel and indifferent. As he walked, he noticed the wind picking up, stirring dust and small pebbles into the air. The temperature, already high, seemed to climb with every passing hour. Jacob paused to drink from his canteen, feeling the water cool and refreshing against his parched throat. He looked around for any sign of life, birds, distant ranches, or even a traveler like himself. But the desert seemed empty, quiet, except for the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. Jacob's thoughts drifted to his uncle, and a pang of sadness struck him. He had missed having guidance, someone to show him the tricks of survival in this unforgiving land. Now he had only himself to rely on, and that reliance was starting to feel fragile. He shook his head, trying to focus on the task at hand: reach the trading post, resupply, and return home before nightfall. Hours passed, and the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Shadows stretched long across the sand and rock, and the once warm, golden light of day turned harsh and glaring. Jacob had walked further than he realized, and the landscape, though familiar in its harsh beauty, began to feel strange and unwelcoming. Every hill and rock formation looked the same, and the trail he had been following seemed to disappear beneath the loose sand. A sense of unease began to settle in his chest. He paused again, scanning the horizon. The wind, which had been a gentle companion earlier, now whipped at his coat and hair with unexpected strength. Dust and tiny rocks whipped against his face, and he pulled his scarf tighter, trying to shield himself. He knew storms came suddenly in the desert, but he had never been caught in one like this before. Suddenly, he spotted movement in the distance, a dark cloud rising rapidly over the land. He squinted, realizing it was a sandstorm barreling toward him faster than he had expected. Panic prickled his skin. He had read about such storms, but reading and living through one were entirely different. There was no time to return to the ranch. The storm would be upon him in minutes. Jacob scanned the terrain, hoping to find any form of shelter, perhaps a cave, a grove of trees, or even a large boulder. His heart pounded in his chest. He spotted a depression in the land, a shallow ravine between 2 low hills. It was hardly ideal, but it was better than facing the full force of the storm out in the open. He ran toward it, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. By the time he reached the ravine, the storm was nearly upon him. The wind howled, carrying sand and grit that stung his eyes and cut at his skin. He pressed himself against the ground, covering his face as best as he could. but the sand still found every exposed inch. His body ached from the run, and he realized how dangerously unprepared he was. Hours of walking under the blazing sun, followed by this sudden tempest, had drained him completely. When the worst of the storm passed, Jacob lifted his head, blinking through the grit and dust. The landscape had changed. The familiar path back to his ranch was gone beneath the shifting sands. He realized he was lost. A cold shiver ran through him, not from the temperature, which remained blistering, but from the realization that he was truly alone. The sun dipped lower, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, and Jacob began to walk again, hoping to find a landmark or a sign of water. His legs were heavy, his throat dry, and every step seemed to take more effort than the last. He tried to stay positive, telling himself he had survived worse, but doubt gnawed at the edges of his determination. As twilight descended, Jacob noticed a faint wisp of smoke in the distance. His heart lifted. Someone was living there. Could it be a rancher, another traveler, or perhaps a small settlement? He forced himself to keep moving, focusing on the smoke as a beacon of hope. Each step was slow, painful, but the thought of finding shelter and help kept him going. Finally, as the sun sank below the horizon, Jacob reached the source of the smoke. Hidden among a cluster of rocks was a small cabin, humble and simple, yet standing firm against the desert winds. He approached cautiously, unsure what he would find inside. The cabin seemed quiet, and no one appeared to be around, but he dared not linger outside. He knocked lightly on the door, then louder, unsure if anyone was home. Silence answered him. His heart sank, but he noticed that the door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open slowly, stepping inside. The interior was modest but clean. A small fire burned in the hearth, though no one was near it. It smelled faintly of herbs and cooked food. Someone had been there recently. Jacob lowered himself to the floor near the fire, grateful for the warmth and the temporary reprieve from the harsh wind outside. He ate some of the dried meat from his pack and drank the last of his water, feeling the relief spread through his exhausted body. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to rest. As he drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, Jacob's thoughts wandered to the cabin's occupants. Who lived here, and why had they left him alone in their home? He felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. He had been alone for so long that the idea of another person, perhaps even strangers, was both comforting and frightening. Night fell fully, and the desert outside became a vast, dark expanse. Jacob remained by the fire, listening to the wind whisper through the rocks and the distant call of a coyote. He felt a strange sense of anticipation, as if something in this place or the people who lived here would change his life forever. He didn't yet know how, but a quiet feeling settled in his chest. His journey had only just begun. Hours passed, and the wind finally died down. Jacob fell into a deeper sleep, unaware that beyond the door, two pairs of watchful eyes were observing him from the shadows. The sisters, hidden for now, were deciding whether this weary traveler was friend or foe, and the first steps of a story that would change Jacob's life were quietly taking shape. Jacob slept, unaware that his life had reached a turning point. The desert, which had seemed harsh and unforgiving, had led him here, to a place that would teach him lessons he could never have imagined. He would soon discover that survival was not only about enduring the elements, but about trust, courage, and the unexpected connections that could shape a life forever. Jacob woke to the gentle glow of dawn filtering through the small cabin window. The desert outside was calm now, bathed in soft shades of pink and gold, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the storm from the previous day. His body ached, his muscles sore from the long walk and the strain of seeking shelter. But the fire from last night still smoldered in the hearth, casting warmth and comfort over the small room. He rubbed his eyes and looked around, noticing small details he hadn't before. The cabin was humble but well kept. A woven rug lay on the floor. A few simple wooden chairs were pushed neatly against the walls, and shelves held jars of dried herbs, nuts, and small seeds. It was clear someone cared for this place, tended to it, and lived in it with purpose. Jacob felt a strange mix of awe and gratitude. Here in this small, hidden cabin, he had found safety in a world that had seemed harsh and uncaring just hours before. Still, he was alone. He waited, listening for any sound of movement. The cabin remained quiet, except for the crackle of the dying fire and the faint chirping of birds outside. Jacob realized he didn't know who had lived here. He wondered if the occupants had left for the day, or if perhaps they were watching him, hidden somewhere beyond his sight. He stepped outside cautiously, his boots crunching against the dry earth. The air was crisp, the desert cooler in the early morning, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. Jacob scanned the surrounding rocks and cliffs, trying to spot any signs of movement. That was when he saw them, two figures moving gracefully among the rocks at a short distance. The first was taller, with a calm, commanding presence. Her eyes were sharp, observing him with careful attention. The second was younger, her movements lighter and quicker, her gaze curious and unafraid. Jacob froze, unsure whether to greet them or retreat. The taller one raised a hand in a cautious gesture, not threatening, but signaling him to stay still. Jacob swallowed nervously. He had never interacted with people like them before. The sisters, he realized, must belong to a group of Apache people living quietly in this remote part of the desert. He had read about their resilience and strength, their deep connection to the land, and the way they protected their families fiercely. But these two women were different. There was no hostility in their eyes, only caution and measured curiosity. "Good morning," Jacob said softly, unsure if they would understand him. He kept his hands visible, hoping to show he meant no harm. I didn't mean to intrude. I was caught in the storm and found your cabin. I didn't know where else to go." The taller sister stepped forward slowly, her eyes never leaving him. She studied him quietly for a long moment, as if weighing his words against what her instincts told her. Finally, she spoke in a calm voice, and though he didn't understand her language fully, the tone was not harsh. It was measured, careful, almost protective. Jacob waited, hoping his actions would speak louder than his words. He set down his pack and removed his coat, showing that he had no weapons other than the small knife at his belt. The younger sister stepped closer, her head tilting curiously. She looked at him with a mixture of amusement and interest, as if wondering what this stranger might do next. The taller sister motioned for him to sit on a nearby rock while she went to fetch a small pot of water. Jacob obeyed, careful not to make sudden movements. When she returned, she handed him the water in a simple clay cup. He drank eagerly, the cool liquid soothing his dry throat, and he felt a wave of gratitude toward these women who had chosen, at least for now, not to turn him away. As he sat there, Jacob tried to learn what he could about them. The taller one, he guessed, was called Ayana. She seemed wise and careful, the kind of person who had seen much in her life and understood the ways of the world. The younger one, Nita, had a playful glimmer in her eyes, and Jacob could tell she was curious about everything he did. He wanted to speak to them, to communicate, but he realized language might be a barrier. Still, he tried. "My name, Jacob," he said slowly. I live on a ranch not far from here. I I was caught in the storm." Ayana's eyes softened slightly, and she nodded once. Nita smiled faintly, a small, shy expression that encouraged him. Jacob took a deep breath and continued, telling them about the ranch, about the isolation, and about how he had grown up learning the basics of farming and animal care, but had never been entirely on his own until now. Ayana listened quietly, nodding occasionally, while Nita seemed fascinated by his words, leaning slightly closer to catch every sentence. Though Jacob could not fully understand their language, he realized that communication could take many forms: gestures, expressions, and shared experiences. He gestured toward the fire inside the cabin and mimed eating, then offered a small smile. Nita's smile widened, and she nodded, understanding that he was grateful for their hospitality. Over the next few days, Jacob learned to live alongside the sisters, observing their routines, their skills, and their connection to the land. Ayana taught him how to gather water from hidden springs, how to recognize which plants were safe to eat, and how to tend small fires without drawing too much attention. Nita showed him how to move quietly among the rocks, how to notice subtle changes in the desert's environment, and how to respect the balance of nature. Jacob was amazed by their knowledge. What he had thought of as an empty, barren desert was alive with lessons he had never known. He began to understand that survival was not just about strength or endurance. It was about observation, patience, and respect for the land. The sisters seemed to live in harmony with the desert in a way he had never imagined. Despite the language barrier, Jacob felt a bond growing. He started to see the sisters not as strangers, but as teachers and guides. Their cautious glances softened into gestures of trust, small smiles, and shared routines. Jacob would fetch water while they tended small tasks, and in return they would offer him guidance and gentle corrections when he made mistakes. One morning, while collecting firewood outside, Jacob noticed a group of vultures circling overhead. He froze, remembering stories he had heard from his uncle about dangers in the desert, but Ayana appeared beside him without a sound. She pointed to the horizon, where a group of travelers moved carefully along a distant trail. Then she shook her head slightly, warning him not to approach. Jacob understood. Some people could not be trusted, and survival sometimes meant avoiding conflict. As the days passed, Jacob's respect for the sisters deepened. He saw how Ayana managed their small home with wisdom and foresight, always thinking ahead, always careful. Nita brought lightness and curiosity, laughter at small moments, and a sense of joy that made the harsh desert feel more like a home than a wilderness. Jacob realized that life with them was more than mere survival. It was about connection, about learning and sharing, and about the quiet strength of those who truly understood the land. Jacob also began to reflect on his own life. He had come to the desert seeking independence, to prove himself capable, but he realized that independence did not mean being alone. True strength, he began to see, came from community, trust, and respect. The sisters had taught him patience, humility, and the courage to accept help when needed. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant streaks of red and orange, Jacob sat outside the cabin, watching Nita carefully tend a small garden. Ayana was nearby, sharpening a knife with practiced precision. Jacob felt a deep sense of gratitude mixed with awe. He had arrived here as a lost, inexperienced young man, exhausted and unsure, and now he felt himself changing. He was learning skills that could save his life, but more than that, he was learning how to live with respect, awareness, and compassion. That night, as Jacob lay near the fire, he realized how much he had grown in just a few days. He had gone from fear and uncertainty to a cautious understanding, from isolation to connection. The sisters had accepted him, taught him, and challenged him, and in return he had begun to feel a sense of belonging he had never known. Though he did not yet know what the future held, Jacob felt a quiet certainty that his life would never be the same. The desert, once a harsh and unforgiving expanse, had become a place of learning, reflection, and unexpected friendships. And the sisters, Ayana and Nita, had become the heart of this new chapter in his life, guiding him with wisdom, patience, and care that he would carry with him forever. Jacob closed his eyes, listening to the desert night, the soft rustle of the wind, the distant cry of an owl, and the quiet rhythm of life around him. He felt a sense of peace he had never known, a feeling that, despite the dangers and challenges that lay ahead, he was exactly where he needed to be. For the first time, he understood that life's most profound lessons often came from the most unexpected places, and that the bonds we form with others could shape our destiny in ways we could never imagine. Jacob had been living with Ayana and Nita for several weeks now. The desert, which had once seemed vast and lonely, had become a classroom, a home, and a place of quiet wonder. Every day brought a new lesson. He learned to track the subtle movements of wildlife, to recognize signs of approaching weather, and to forage for food without damaging the delicate balance of the land. Ayana's eyes were always sharp, observing, teaching, without speaking much, while Nita's curiosity brought moments of laughter and lightness. One morning, Jacob awoke to the sound of rustling outside the cabin. He sat up quickly, heart racing, and saw Nita standing at the doorway, looking tense. Ayana was beside her, her face calm but serious. Something in the air told Jacob that today would not be like the other days. Without words, Ayana gestured for Jacob to follow her. They moved silently across the rocks, Nita skipping ahead and then looking back to make sure he was keeping pace. Jacob noticed the usual calmness of the desert had changed. The wind carried an unfamiliar scent, and the distant cries of birds seemed sharper, more urgent. They reached a small ridge, where the desert spread out in waves of golden sand and jagged rocks. Jacob's eyes widened as he saw a group of men on horseback in the distance. They were unfamiliar, moving with purpose, and their presence brought a sudden chill of fear to his chest. Ayana crouched low, signaling him to do the same. Jacob realized that these men could be dangerous. Outlaws often roamed the desert, seeking supplies, gold, or livestock. He had heard stories from his uncle, tales of settlers and travelers who were ambushed in remote areas. The sisters' caution now made perfect sense. Ayana whispered, her tone calm but urgent, guiding Jacob to stay hidden behind a rock. She pointed to the men, making small gestures that Jacob understood to mean do not approach, do not make noise, and be ready to move if necessary. Nita peeked from behind another boulder, her face pale but determined. Jacob felt his pulse quicken. He had never faced a threat like this. His hands tightened around the small knife at his belt, but he knew it would be useless against men on horseback. The only choice was to rely on the sisters' knowledge of the land and their guidance. Hours passed as they watched the men from their hidden position. The riders moved methodically, scanning the land, and it was clear they were searching for something. Jacob learned to control his breathing, to remain still, and to notice details he had once overlooked: the direction of the wind, the movement of shadows, and the subtle changes in the landscape that could signal danger or opportunity. Finally, Ayana made a decision. She signaled for Jacob and Nita to follow her down a narrow ravine, one that twisted between rocks and led to a small hidden canyon. Jacob moved carefully, stepping where she had shown him, trusting her instincts. Nita followed close behind, whispering encouragement when Jacob stumbled over a rock. By mid-afternoon, they reached a secluded spot that provided shelter and a clear view of the approaching men. From this vantage point, Jacob could see the riders more clearly. They were well-armed and determined, their intentions unclear but threatening. Ayana's eyes scanned the horizon, calculating, planning. Jacob realized that she was preparing a strategy to protect them, and he felt a mixture of admiration and awe. As they waited, Jacob reflected on how much he had changed since arriving at the cabin. He had gone from a young, inexperienced rancher to someone who could observe, learn, and adapt. Yet he also understood that true survival required more than skill. It required courage, trust, and the willingness to face fear head-on. The sisters had shown him that strength was not about aggression, but about awareness, patience, and unity. Hours later, the men appeared to move on, disappearing over a distant ridge. Ayana waited until they were completely gone before allowing Jacob and Nita to relax. She led them back to the cabin, where the fire burned steadily, a symbol of warmth and safety in a world that could be harsh and unpredictable. That night, Jacob sat near the fire, reflecting on what had happened. He realized that danger could appear suddenly, but with knowledge, preparation, and trust, it could be managed. He also understood that the sisters had taught him something even more important: the value of family and loyalty, even in the most unexpected forms. In the following days, Jacob's bond with Ayana and Nita deepened further. He learned to cook simple meals over the fire, to mend clothing and tools, and to anticipate the needs of the household. He discovered that survival was not just about physical strength, but about observation, patience, and empathy. The sisters shared their skills with him, and he offered what he could in return, creating a rhythm of mutual respect and trust. One morning, while collecting water from a hidden spring, Jacob noticed a wounded coyote struggling near the edge of the stream. He froze, unsure whether to approach, but Nita appeared beside him, gently urging him forward. They worked together to tend the animal, using knowledge of herbs and careful handling. Jacob felt a profound sense of accomplishment and connection as the coyote's breathing steadied and it limped away, stronger than before. This moment, small as it seemed, marked a turning point for Jacob. He realized that life was not just about surviving oneself, but about nurturing and protecting the world around him. The desert, once a place of hardship and loneliness, had become a living, breathing ecosystem that demanded respect and care. And through the sisters' guidance, he had learned to be part of it. Yet the desert was not without its challenges. One evening, as Jacob and the sisters returned from gathering firewood, they discovered that a portion of their small garden had been disturbed. Tracks in the sand suggested that animals, or perhaps strangers, had been near. Ayana's eyes narrowed, and she motioned for Jacob to stay calm and alert. Nita's usual playfulness was gone, replaced by a focused determination. For the first time, Jacob felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him. He had been learning and observing, but now he had to act. Under Ayana's guidance, they set small traps and placed natural deterrents to protect their home. Jacob felt a sense of pride and capability as he worked alongside them, realizing that he was no longer just a visitor in their world, but an active participant in its protection. Days later, a sudden desert thunderstorm swept across the horizon. Jacob, Ayana, and Nita rushed to secure the cabin and gather supplies. The wind howled, and rain began to fall in sheets, soaking the desert floor and turning dry gullies into rushing streams. Jacob struggled to keep pace, carrying buckets of water and helping Nita move fragile supplies. The storm was intense, but together they managed to protect their home and each other. As the storm passed and the desert returned to its calm golden state, Jacob realized that he had grown stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. He had faced danger, uncertainty, and fear, and he had emerged resilient. The sisters had not only taught him survival skills, but had shown him the importance of courage, loyalty, and trust. One afternoon, as they rested near the cabin, Nita began to hum a soft melody, her voice carrying across the desert. Ayana smiled faintly, joining her with gentle harmonies. Jacob listened, mesmerized, feeling a deep sense of peace and belonging. He realized that this connection, this shared rhythm of life, was more valuable than anything he had known before. In the weeks that followed, Jacob continued to learn, grow, and bond with the sisters. He explored the desert under their guidance, discovering hidden springs, secret trails, and the quiet beauty of the land. He began to understand the delicate balance of life in the desert, the way every plant, animal, and human had a role to play. Jacob also began to reflect on his own past. He remembered the loneliness of the ranch, the struggles of living alone, and the sense of aimlessness that had weighed on him. Now, with the sisters, he felt purpose, direction, and a deep sense of connection. He understood that life was not just about surviving, but about learning, growing, and forming bonds that could shape one's destiny. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and red, Jacob stood at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the desert. The wind carried the scent of sage and wild flowers, and the world seemed to stretch endlessly before him. He thought of the challenges he had faced, the lessons he had learned, and the bonds he had formed. He realized that his life had changed in ways he could never have imagined, and that the journey was far from over. Jacob's heart swelled with gratitude. He had arrived in the desert as a lost and inexperienced young man, uncertain of his abilities and unsure of his future. Now he felt capable, confident, and deeply connected to the land and the people who had taken him in. Ayana and Nita had not only provided shelter, but had guided him toward a life of meaning, purpose, and belonging. As night fell, Jacob sat near the fire, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast desert sky. He felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was no longer alone. The desert had tested him, the sisters had taught him, and he had grown stronger in ways he had never imagined. Jacob closed his eyes, listening to the gentle rustle of the wind and the distant cries of night creatures. He felt a quiet certainty that life's most important lessons often came from unexpected places, and that the bonds we form with others could shape our destiny in ways we could never anticipate. For the first time, he understood that true strength lay not just in survival, but in courage, compassion, and the willingness to embrace the unknown. The desert had changed since Jacob had first arrived. What had once seemed empty and harsh was now alive with memory, experience, and lessons learned. The wind that had once felt cruel now carried scents that reminded him of home, of safety, and of the bonds he had formed with Ayana and Nita. Life in the cabin was no longer temporary. It had become a part of him. One morning, as the sun rose slowly over the desert ridges, Jacob noticed something unusual in the distance. Dust clouds were forming on the horizon, and the sound of hooves beating against the hard earth reached his ears. His heart sank. The outlaws or travelers he had feared before were returning, and they seemed closer, faster, and more determined this time. Ayana appeared beside him silently, her expression calm but focused. Nita emerged from the cabin, her brow furrowed with concern. Jacob felt a twinge of fear, but he also felt something stronger, a sense of responsibility. He had learned how to survive in the desert, how to observe and act, and now he would have to put all of those lessons into practice. Ayana gestured for them to move to higher ground, a rocky ridge that overlooked the path the men were taking. From this vantage point, they could see the strangers more clearly. They were well armed and seemed to be searching for someone, or something. Jacob realized that this time, the threat was real and immediate. He looked at the sisters, noting their calm determination. Ayana's eyes scanned the horizon, calculating, planning. Nita's movements were quick and precise, gathering small stones and sticks to create makeshift defenses. Jacob felt a surge of admiration and gratitude. These women had not only saved his life, but had taught him courage, patience, and strategy. "Stay low," Ayana whispered, her voice steady. "Watch, learn, and be ready to move when I signal." Jacob nodded, gripping his knife, though he knew it was more for comfort than for actual use. They crouched behind rocks, observing the men as they moved closer. Jacob felt the tension in every muscle, his senses heightened by the desert's silence and the sisters' quiet guidance. Hours passed and the men drew nearer to the cabin. Ayana signaled for Jacob and Nita to follow her carefully down a narrow, hidden path. The rocks and crevices provided cover, allowing them to stay out of sight. Jacob's heart raced as he realized how vulnerable the cabin, and they themselves, would be if discovered. Suddenly, one of the men raised a rifle, scanning the land. Jacob froze, but Ayana's hand on his shoulder reminded him to remain calm. They moved slowly, deliberately, keeping to shadows and natural cover. Nita whispered instructions in her language, and Jacob followed without question, trusting their guidance completely. As they approached the cabin from a safe distance, Ayana gestured to set a small trap using stones and branches. It was simple but effective, a warning system to alert them if anyone attempted to approach the home directly. Jacob helped, feeling the thrill of preparation and the responsibility of protection. The men circled the area, unaware of the trap and the hidden eyes watching them. Ayana's careful planning and the sisters' knowledge of the land allowed them to remain unseen. Jacob marveled at their skill, realizing how much he had learned from them in just a few weeks. He had gone from a naive, inexperienced rancher to someone capable of observation, strategy, and action in the face of danger. As the men moved on, seemingly giving up their search, Ayana signaled that it was safe to return to the cabin. Jacob exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of relief and pride. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and potential danger, and had survived with the guidance of the sisters and his own growing confidence. Back at the cabin, Jacob felt a profound sense of gratitude. He looked at Ayana and Nita, realizing that they had become more than teachers or protectors. They were family. He wanted to express his appreciation, but words felt insufficient. Instead, he offered a small smile, which Nita returned warmly, and Ayana's eyes softened, acknowledging his courage and growth. The days following the encounter were filled with reflection and quiet activity. Jacob continued to learn from the sisters, refining his skills and deepening his understanding of the desert. He learned to track animals, anticipate weather changes, and respect the delicate balance of life in this harsh environment. Every task, from gathering water to tending the small garden, became a lesson in patience, observation, and care. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Jacob sat outside the cabin, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. He remembered the sandstorm that had nearly ended his life, the fear and uncertainty he had felt, and the small cabin that had offered refuge. He realized that every challenge had led him to this moment, shaping him into a person capable of resilience, empathy, and trust. Nita approached, carrying a small bundle of herbs. She handed it to Jacob, who nodded in gratitude. Together they worked by the fire, preparing a simple meal. The act felt ordinary, but Jacob understood its significance. Survival was not just about facing danger. It was about collaboration, care, and sharing life with others. As they ate, Ayana spoke softly, telling stories of her own childhood, of lessons learned from her parents and the land. Jacob listened intently, absorbing not only the words, but the wisdom behind them. He realized that life's true education came from experience, guidance, and the bonds formed with others. Days turned into weeks, and Jacob grew stronger, wiser, and more connected to the desert and the sisters. He learned to anticipate changes in the environment, to prepare for storms, and to navigate the land with confidence. But more importantly, he discovered the value of family, loyalty, and trust. The sisters had given him shelter, protection, and knowledge, but they had also given him a sense of belonging he had never known. One afternoon, while exploring a distant canyon with Nita, Jacob stumbled upon a hidden spring. The water was clear and cool, a rare treasure in the arid landscape. Nita smiled, her eyes bright, and Jacob felt a surge of joy. It was a reminder that the desert, while harsh, held beauty and life for those willing to observe and respect it. Returning to the cabin, they shared their discovery with Ayana, who nodded in approval. Together, they decided to use the spring as a resource, carefully managing it to ensure it would sustain them and the surrounding wildlife. Jacob marveled at the sisters' foresight and respect for the land, realizing that true survival required harmony with nature, not domination over it. As the weeks passed, Jacob's life transformed completely. He had arrived at the cabin as a lost, inexperienced young man, unsure of his abilities and fearful of the unknown. Now he was confident, capable, and deeply connected to the sisters and the desert. He understood the rhythms of life, the importance of preparation and observation, and the value of trust and loyalty. One evening, as the stars emerged in the vast desert sky, Jacob sat with Ayana and Nita near the fire. The air was cool, and the desert was quiet, filled with the soft sounds of night creatures. Jacob felt a profound sense of peace. He had faced danger, learned valuable lessons, and formed bonds that would last a lifetime. "I never imagined my life would be like this," Jacob said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ayana and Nita listened, their expressions calm and attentive. "I thought I was strong enough to live alone, but I've learned that strength comes from more than just surviving. It comes from trust, courage, and caring for others." Nita smiled, her eyes shining in the firelight. She reached out and touched his hand gently, a simple gesture of connection and understanding. Ayana nodded, her gaze steady, acknowledging the truth in his words. Jacob realized that the desert had taught him more than survival. It had shown him the value of family, friendship, and compassion. It had taught him that life's greatest challenges could become life's greatest lessons when faced with courage and an open heart. In the following months, Jacob continued to work alongside the sisters, tending the cabin, gathering resources, and exploring the desert. He learned to anticipate danger, to respect the land, and to act with patience and care. The bond between them grew stronger, rooted in trust, shared experience, and mutual respect. One day, as they watched the sun rise over the horizon, painting the desert in brilliant shades of gold, Jacob reflected on how far he had come. He remembered the fear and uncertainty of his early days, the harsh lessons of the sandstorm, and the kindness and guidance of Ayana and Nita. He realized that his life had been transformed in ways he could never have imagined. Jacob understood that true strength was not measured by survival alone, but by the courage to face the unknown, the wisdom to learn from others, and the compassion to care for those around him. The sisters had shown him that life was not just about enduring hardship, but about forming connections, learning from experience, and embracing the journey, no matter how difficult or unexpected it might be. As night fell and the desert settled into quiet, Jacob sat by the fire, feeling a sense of fulfillment and peace. The stars above seemed brighter than ever, reflecting the clarity and growth he had found within himself. He knew that the lessons of the desert and the sisters would remain with him forever, shaping the person he had become and guiding him through the challenges and joys yet to come. Jacob's life, once solitary and uncertain, had become rich with connection, knowledge, and purpose. He had discovered courage, resilience, and the power of trust. And he knew that no matter what lay ahead, he was no longer the same young man who had wandered into the desert weeks ago. His life had been changed forever, by the storm, by the desert, and by the remarkable sisters who had taken him in and shown him a new way to live.